O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here with you. As you know, we're nearing the end of the season of Epiphany right now. Typically, it's one of those times of year that gives everyone a breather between the big holidays of Christmas and Easter. But in spite of that, this time actually deserves to be explored in greater depth, precisely because it falls between those big holidays, a unique time for reflection on them without the need to get wrapped up in all the busyness that ordinarily surrounds them. And that is where I begin my thoughts today, precisely there. So first, think about Christmas for a moment. It should be pretty fresh in your memories. Apart from the inspirational pageantry and the secular partying that have come to define that season, Christmas is the celebration of the coming into our world of someone who will, in a very real sense, set us free. Now, ultimate power over freedom and slavery, or even over life and death, in Jesus' time, typically belonged to rulers like the Caesars. And thus Luke described the birth of Jesus in the same over-the-top metaphoric terminology used back then to describe a divine, noble birth like that of, for instance, Augustus Caesar. Beyond the other end of this season of Epiphany, we have Holy Week and Easter. Again, looking beyond the drama and pageantry of a season that has also in large part come to define Christianity, we find the story of the trial and execution of that same person, the Messiah, who was sent to set us free from death. The title of Messiah in those days described one who promised to lead oppressed people to freedom. And we hear it repeatedly throughout both the Christmas and Easter seasons. That is the job description of a Messiah. Jesus, however, was the unexpected Messiah. Those others using that title, and back then there were plenty of them, sought to cast off their oppression through force of arms, what we would call today sedition. That's why calling yourself Messiah in those days could have deadly consequences. Sedition, whether against Romans or Jews, was never tolerated. And armed sedition was dealt with swiftly and cruelly. As I said, Jesus was completely unexpected in the way he used the title Messiah. From all we know, those who followed Jesus were not armed, they were not well organized, and they were also relatively few in number. Nevertheless, Jesus was still accused of the same crime of sedition against both the Jewish temple authorities and the Roman occupiers, and executed as though he had planned to lead an armed rebellion against them. This should leave all of us with vital questions to ponder as we prepare for Holy Week, Easter, and the rest of our lives. First, what was the real nature of the sedition Jesus was charged with? And if he was a Messiah, what was he trying to free us from? And vitally for us, how does that change our lives today? Ash Wednesday is a scant 10 days away, believe it or not. Lent is when we are supposed to find time to reflect on these things and look for meaningful answers. Let me continue my insights by noting that the temple elite who desperately wanted Jesus executed did not necessarily want to overthrow the Roman authorities. Instead, they had what one might say was a symbiotic relationship with them. The Jews could govern the day-to-day lives of the people under them and collect their own taxes, and become rich and remain powerful if they could also manage to keep the population peacefully under control. The Romans, in turn, could tax the Jewish nation and skim off what they wanted from the goods that passed through the cities and ports of what is called the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. The more peaceful the population was, the less it cost the empire to maintain it. A win-win situation. And somehow a situation that Jesus threatened in what he taught and did. There are really two very different kinds of freedom, and they are found along two very different paths. Freedom from local oppression, the kind that a group or nation might seek, can come via the leadership of a strong individual, a Messiah who gathers followers seeking freedom and who can also focus the feelings of the group, turn them into an army, literally whip the followers up until their fear and anger spill over into violence to remove the sources of oppression they hate. Almost always, this only replaces one form of oppression for another, and the cycle inevitably repeats. The second path to freedom, the one no one seems to expect, and I believe the one Jesus meant for us to have, places the responsibility of leadership not in the hands of a single person, but in the hands of each and every one of us as individuals. Such was the radical nature of what Jesus taught. Our real individual freedom is completely personal, intimate, individual. It is never achieved by obediently following others, but solely through the conscience of the individual. The conscience of the individual. Personal conscience is the sole basis for personal freedom. Your mortal body is given an immortal soul, but perhaps as a consequence of this union, you also have a mortal conscience as well. And through it, you are free. Think of this path of conscience as living your life intentionally, but guided both by a unique and personal awareness of yourself and your world, as well as by your inward sense of right and wrong, your cognitive dissonance, as it is often called. Collective freedom that is the result of actions of physical, social, or political violence denies the consciences of those who seek freedom along such paths. Followers of those paths must, in the end, act without personal conscience, and thus their obedience as followers can be also easily manipulated. On the other hand, freedom that springs from a person's own conscience is theirs alone to use, defend, nourish. It is also theirs alone to maintain or to surrender to the collective. Jesus knew this, I believe, and his teaching was meant to show by words and actions to anyone who would watch and listen that less obvious personal path that leads to personal freedom. In his day, the manipulation, the groupthink or echo chamber or whatever you want to call it, came primarily from the Jewish temple and thus from the rich and powerful leaders who controlled, dictated, and manipulated the lives of everyone under their authority. In their world, personal conscience-driven freedom was unthinkable. And anyone promoting this alternative way would have to be crushed. Of course, Jesus had to die. In their view, he was more dangerous than any army because he had no army. Those living personally free lives would become, each of them, a personal army of one. Impossible to control and more powerful than those ruling them could ever imagine. You see, conscience does not promote collective anger and violence, but rather the moral outrage of scores of individuals, moral outrage that springs solely from their individuality. Large armies are crippled by the death of their leaders, their messiahs. Throngs of people acting individually out of conscience and moral outrage are almost impossible to stop. If we choose the path of conscience and freedom, then we are each called to take up our own crosses and become examples of a new kind of Messiah. Along this path, no person is above another or better than any other. We all are, as Jesus taught, here to wash one another's feet, bear one another's burdens, provide for a common good. Today we live in a world that seems to treat the importance of the power of any individual with cynicism. A lot of people feel this, and their sense is one of disempowerment, often seeking solace hiding within large groups or our personal bubbles of technology. But seldom in history, perhaps never before, has an entire world stood so precariously on a brink. Perhaps never before has an entire world waited to see if what Jesus was trying to teach each of us will make a difference. This may seem like a time to act, to make a difference, but actions that are taken without personal conscience are never made freely, and thus can never lead to freedom of any kind. An entire world waits with either consternation or hope to see what each one of us will do, to see if conscience will prevail. So if conscience and freedom and conscience can only abide together in each of us, what does that mean for our lives today? What are some of the dangers to conscience that we must watch for? Well, let me point out the obvious thing first, and maybe it isn't all that obvious. Conscience does not and cannot belong to any group, family, corporation, nation, government, army, or even to any religion. Never. It exists solely within each one of us personally. But let me add, this is not an indictment of the groups we belong to. We will always need them, and for a variety of reasons. Abandoning them makes no sense. We just need to be aware that although we may usefully belong to groups, we need not be defined or restricted by them. Individuals within a group can still have personal conscience and therefore personal freedom. But these things will never belong to the collective. Next, conscience and freedom cannot survive things that we call groupthink or echo chambers or things like that, or the kind of information sources that require some measure of either lies or deception in order to maintain control over us. Conscience must be nourished by the truth and reason that symbolize conscience at work in those around us. Conscience recognizes conscience. It is probably safe to say that conscience and the freedom it brings are at the very core of any democracy, though conscience must never be politically aligned. And while conscience does not always lead to action, it must never otherwise be denied or left unnourished. Here's where your spiritual life and thus your soul come in. and why you're hearing this in church and on a Sunday morning. If what brought you here this morning nourishes anything within you, and I dearly hope it does, then the meal we are about to share must become your own very personal and intimate moment in which you, your conscience, and your immortal soul are all sustained for a very dangerous but rewarding journey. Amen.